in the past such votes. But Republicans instead cast aside the archives. They used for every nominee since Watergate for a partisan one. And I think you only have to look at Watergate to see why we have that nonpartisan process. It's followed by every nomination since Watergate until today. And my question still recurs, what is being hidden and why? Every White House record that we've received was handpicked by your deputy in the Bush White House. A hyper-conflicted lawyer who also represents a half dozen Trump administration officials who are under investigation by prosecutors in the Russian investigation. And this partisan lawyers decided which of your records the Senate, but more importantly, the American people get to see. And fourth, countless documents that have been provided to the committee contain apparent alterations and omissions with zero explanation. No court in this country, certainly no court that I ever argued cases before, would accept this as a legitimate document production. And the United States Senate shouldn't either. And fifth, more than 40% of the documents we have received, almost 190,000 pages, are considered committee confidential by Chairman Grassley. For the vast majority of them, there's not even a conceivable argument to restrict them. Compare this to the mere 860 documents that were designated committee confidential for Justice Kagan, and that the request was made by the nonpartisan archives, not by this committee. And we still had 99% of our records. And sixth, on Friday, we learned that President Trump is claiming executive privilege over an additional 102,000 pages of your records. Such a blanket assertion of executive privilege is simply unheard of in the history of this country. And the reason it's unheard of is because it is so outrageous. The last time a president attempted to hide a Supreme Court nominee's records by invoking executive privilege was when President Reagan did this for Justice William Rehnquist. But then Republicans and Democrats came together. We demanded the documents be released. And President Reagan said, okay, and they were released. Boy, how times have changed. And seventh to date, we've received less than half of Chairman Grassley's partial records request, meaning we're moving forward even though we've received a fraction of the records. Even Republicans claimed they needed to vet your nomination just a few weeks ago. And then we received an additional 42,000 pages from your record a few hours ago. The notion that anyone here has properly reviewed them or even seen them at all is laughable. It's laughable. It doesn't pass the giggle test. That alone would be reason to postpone during normal times. But nothing about this is normal. All told, only 4% of your White House record has been shared with the public. Only 7% has been made available to this committee. The rest remains hidden from scrutiny. Compare this to the 99% of Justice Kagan's White House record that was available to all Americans. As a result of the bipartisan process I ran within ranking member Jeff Sessions, when Senator Sessions and I requested them, and we got 99%. What is being hidden and why? And if I've not been clear, I will be so now. Today, the Senate is not simply phoning in our vetting obligation, we're discarding it. It's not only shameful, it's a sham. I felt on the day when I took my oath of office the first time, 44 years ago, I was told by both the Republican and Democratic leadership of the Senate, people I highly respected, that the Senate should be and can be the conscience of the nation. I've represented Vermont here for 44 years. I've served with pride here, believing that the Senate can be and should be the conscience of the nation. Today, with this hearing, it is not being the conscience of the nation. And from the bits and pieces of your record we've received, it appears you provided misleading testimony about your involvement in controversial issues at the Bush White House during your previous confirmation hearings. Misleading testimony. I asked you about these concerns last month, and I want to alert you that I will return to those concerns when you are under oath and I'm asking you questions. What I fear is the American people will not know the full truth until your full record is public, and unfortunately, Republicans have done their best to ensure that won't happen. So we begin these hearings with gaping holes spanning multiple years of your career, that deeply influenced by your own words, your thinking as a judge. And any claim that this has been a thorough, transparent process is downright Orwellian. This is the most incomplete, most partisan, least transparent vetting for any Supreme Court nominee I have ever seen. And I've seen more of those than any person serving in the Senate today. So Judge Kavanaugh, this hearing is premature. I hope you will use it, though, to answer our questions directly, clearly, and honestly. Because the American people have real concerns about how your confirmation will affect their lives. And I'll conclude with this. The Supreme Court is a guarantor of our liberties in our republic. Few, I would argue, are worthy of taking a seat. Only those with unimpeachable integrity. Only those who believe that truth is more important than party. Only those who are committed to upholding the rights of all Americans, not just those in power. As you know, inscribed in Vermont marble, above the court's entrance are the words, equal justice under law. For the millions of Americans fearful that they're on the verge of losing hard-fought rights, that aspiration has never been more important than it is today. Frankly, remember this thing, and as the United States said, I feel it's going to be more at risk. Thank you.
Before I call on Senator Cornyn, how ridiculous it is to say that we don't have the records that it takes to determine this person qualified to be on the Supreme Court, and all the documents we have add up to more than we have had for the last 5 Supreme Court nominees. How do we make those decisions for those other 5?
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Cornyn.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just respond to that point, because you're not giving the whole picture, sir. 90% of the documents we haven't seen. It's not the number of documents.
And I'll be glad to respond to that. But
we wouldn't hire an intern, sir, with only 90% of their resume. We're putting somebody on the Supreme Court.
Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Judge Kavanaugh, welcome to you and your family and friends. I'm amazed at the poker faces I've seen on the front row during all of this pandemonium, unlike anything I've seen before in a confirmation hearing. In my view, it's not because your opponents don't know enough about you. It's because they do know all they need to know, apparently, to oppose your nomination. And even before you've had a chance to answer our questions, including their questions, many of them have made up their minds, but the American people have not been introduced to you before. This is an opportunity for all of us to engage in a question and answer format that will hopefully illuminate why it is so important to have judges who actually are tethered to the text of the laws passed by Congress, signed by the President, as well as the Constitution of the United States. The Senate Judiciary Committee undertakes few more important tasks than the one before us today. Last year, the committee considered and advanced the nomination of Justice Neil Gorsuch, who was just one of many outstanding judicial nominees by President Trump. This Congress has proudly confirmed not just Judge Gorsuch, but 26 judges to the appellate courts across the nation. This includes 3 outstanding Texans to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Historically, the confirmation of judges to our highest courts was somewhat routine. Justice Gorsuch was unanimously confirmed by a simple voice vote to the Court of Appeals. Not one senator voted against Justice Kennedy, who both you and Justice Gorsuch clerked for, and who you will succeed on the court. Not one senator voted against Justice Scalia's confirmation, who you have called a role model and a hero. But that was before judges were viewed as policymakers rather than fair and neutral interpreters of the Constitution and the laws drafted by Congress. Today, as I suggested, is a wonderful opportunity to re-examine the proper role for judges under our Constitution and the difference between legislators and judges. As Justice Gorsuch wrote before he joined the Supreme Court, upholding and enforcing this distinction between legislators and judges was the great project of the late Justice Scalia's career. Justice Scalia would always remind us that legislators may appeal to their own moral convictions and to claims about social utility, but judges instead should strive to apply the law as it is, looking to the text, structure, and history, not to decide cases based on their own moral convictions or the policy consequences. So this hearing is an outstanding way to remind the American people of the proper role of judges under our Constitution. Our Constitution provides for a federal government of limited and delegated powers with a Bill of Rights to further protect our individual liberties. To that end, the framers created 3 co-equal branches, as you know: the legislature to enact laws, the executive to enforce them, and the judicial branch to settle disputes about the meaning of those laws and the Constitution. Of course, the legislature could change the laws, but only an amendment can change the Constitution. For this reason, Alexander Hamilton wrote in the Federalist Papers. Mr. Chairman, could I pause there until the room is cleared?
Yeah.
Thank you. For this reason, Alexander Hamilton wrote in the Federalist Papers that the judiciary will always be the least dangerous branch because, as he famously wrote, judges would have neither force nor will, but merely judgment. Today, the Judiciary Committee is gathered to consider whether Judge Kavanaugh will honor that limited role for judges under our Constitution and whether he will properly exercise the modest and humble power of judgment entrusted to him under our Constitution. I'm confident the Senate will find that Judge Kavanaugh will faithfully and fairly interpret the Constitution and the laws of this great nation, and I look forward to him succeeding Justice Kennedy. One reason for that is because I've been acquainted with Judge Kavanaugh for about 18 years, and I can personally attest to his skills as a lawyer. When I was Attorney General of Texas, as the judge will recall, he helped me get ready for a Supreme Court argument. May I proceed, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
As I was saying, and it's, when I was Attorney General of Texas, I had a chance to argue a couple of cases in front of the United States Supreme Court. One case Judge Kavanaugh helped me prepare for was one involving the question of school prayer at a high school football game at the Santa Fe Independent School District High School. After that, I was pleased to introduce Judge Kavanaugh to the Judiciary Committee when President Bush first nominated him to be a judge on the D.C. Circuit. What I said back then still stands the test of time today. Judge Kavanaugh has an unparalleled academic and professional record of service. Many will cite his education, his clerkships, his time arguing cases before the court, his experience working for the executive branch. But I think one of the most important factors to me is he's already exercised excellent judgment in marrying a Texan, Ashley from Abilene. So I know he's a good judge. In fact, Judge Kavanaugh is one of the most respected and thoughtful judges in the country. I am disappointed that despite his exemplary qualifications and outstanding record, so many of our colleagues across the aisle have announced their opposition even before he was nominated. The level of disingenuousness and hyperbole, even by today's standards, is extraordinary. Members from the other side of the aisle, including some who serve on this committee, have claimed that confirming Judge Kavanaugh would somehow be complicit in evil and the result in the destruction of the Constitution. Some have even claimed that you testified falsely. We've already heard that alluded to before the committee when you were serving our country in the Bush White House. I hope you'll have a chance to explain the apparent misunderstanding on the part of some senators. And I sincerely hope this week we can all take a deep breath. We're not doing very well so far. And get a grip and treat this process with the respect and gravity it demands. As others have alluded, the American Bar Association, which some have called the gold standard for judicial evaluations, have unanimously rated you as well qualified for service on the Supreme Court. And as we've heard, a number of lawyers and judges across the spectrum have talked about your qualifications and sung your praises. And I'm confident at the end of this hearing, your stellar credentials and your body of work as a judge will demonstrate that you properly understand the role of a judge under the Constitution. And I'm confident you will demonstrate that you will faithfully and fairly interpret the text of the law and the Constitution and dutifully apply them to the disputes that come before you. Finally, Judge, I expect we'll have a conversation or two about this book, which you contributed to, and the law of judicial precedent, because I know that there's a number of questions by members of the Senate about how you will regard previously decided cases in the Supreme Court. And I trust you'll give us a scholarly and detailed explanation of that, and demonstrate that many of the concerns that have been expressed about a new justice coming on the court somehow wiping away previous decisions single-handedly, not even with the help of other members of the court, is just plain ridiculous. And we look forward to asking those questions and getting your answer. Thank you very much.
Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Judge Kavanaugh, it's good to see you again. I thank the members of your family who are weathering this hearing. Thank you very much for being here today. This is a different hearing for the Supreme Court than I've ever been through. It's different in what's happened in this room just this morning. What we've heard is the noise of democracy. This is what happens in a free country when people can stand up and speak and not be jailed, imprisoned, tortured, or killed because of it. It is not mob rule. There have been times when it is uncomfortable. I'm sure it was for your children. I hope you can explain this to them at some point. But it does represent what we are about in this democracy. Why is this happening for the first time in the history of this committee? I think we need to be honest about why it's happening. I think it's the same reason why when I go home to Illinois after being in this public service job for over 30 years, I hear a question that I've never, ever heard before, repeatedly, as people pull me off to the side and say, Senator, are we going to be all right? Is America going to be all right? They're genuinely concerned about the future of this country. You come to this moment of history in a rare situation. You are aspiring to be the most decisive vote on the Supreme Court on critical issues. Justice Kennedy did that for 12 years. And you are called to that responsibility. And we realize the gravity of that opportunity and that responsibility. Secondly, of course, your record and the statements of others suggests there's real, genuine concern about changing life and death values in this country because you see things differently. We've heard that over and over again, and I think you must understand the depth of feeling about that possibility. And third, try as they might, I'm afraid the majority just can't get beyond the fact that there are parts of your public life that they want to conceal. They don't want America to see them. I think that's a serious mistake, and I'm going to make a suggestion at the end of my remarks. But over and above all of those things is this. You are the nominee of President Donald John Trump. This is a president who's shown us consistently that he is contemptuous of the rule of law. He has said and done things as president which we've never seen before in our history. He has dismissed the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation when he wouldn't bend to his will. He harasses and threatens his own Attorney General on almost a daily basis in the exercise of his office. And I didn't vote for Jeff Sessions. But I have to tell you, there should be some respect, at least for the office that he serves in. And it's that president who's decided you are his man. You're the person he wants on the Supreme Court. You are his personal choice. So are people nervous about this? Are they concerned about it? Of course they are. I'm sure there'll be a shower of tweets sometime later in the day, harassing people in the cabinet, people in the White House, maybe even dismissing them. And maybe he'll go after me again, be my guest. But the point I'm getting to is if you wonder why this reaction is taking place, it's because what's happening in this country. There are many of us who are concerned about the future of this country and the future of democracy. And you are asking for a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the land where you will make decisions, the deciding vote on things that will decide the course of history and where we are headed. The Senate has a constitutional responsibility to evaluate your nomination. We do know that before you became a judge, you were faithfully advancing the Republican Party agenda. I jokingly said in one of your previous appearances that you're like the Forrest Gump of Republican politics. You always show up in the picture. Whether it's the Ken Starr investigation, Bush versus Gore, the Bush White House, you've been there. We also know that before naming you, President Trump made it clear that he would appoint justices, only appoint justices to the Supreme Court who would overturn Roe versus Wade and the Affordable Care Act. Those were his litmus tests. Now, he didn't ask you the question. What he did was to delegate this responsibility to two special interest groups, the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation, and the other groups that are spending millions of dollars in support of your candidacy. They're confident that you're going to favor the interests of corporations over workers and give the president wide berth when it comes to executive authority. And your own law clerks, men and women you chose, men and women who wrote the words that had your signature at the bottom of the page, have told us what they think of you. One wrote in an article entitled, quote, Brett Kavanaugh said Obamacare was unprecedented and unlawful. That's from one of your clerks. Another wrote, when it comes to, quote, enforcing restrictions on abortion, no court of appeals judge in the nation has a stronger, more consistent record than Judge Brett Kavanaugh. Big corporate interests solidly behind your nomination. Chamber of Commerce, full support. President Trump's, whose lawyers say they will fight any effort to subpoena or indict him all the way to the Supreme Court, that president seems personally eager to have you confirmed as quickly as possible. Why are your supporters so confident you'll rule on these issues as they wish? Why do they think you're such a sure bet to take their side when, in the words of one of your former clerks, this is no time for a gamble? Unfortunately, I don't think you're going to tell us much this week. It's interesting to me that people in your position write all these law review articles, make all these speeches, and come to this room and clam up. Don't want to talk about any issues, but that's what I expect. Instead, we'll be asked to trust that if you're confirmed, you'll have an open mind, that you'll follow the law rather than move the law in your direction of your views. I'd like to trust you, but I agree with President Ronald Reagan. Trust but verify. I wanted to trust you the last time you testified before this committee in 2006, but after you were confirmed at the D.C. Circuit, reports surfaced that contradicted your sworn testimony before this committee. You said to me unambiguously, under oath, the following: I was not involved and am not involved in the questions about the rules governing detention of combatants. But later, just a week or so ago, you acknowledged in my office that you were involved. For 12 years, you could have apologized and corrected this record, but you never did. Instead, you and your supporters have argued we should ignore that simple declarative sentence which you spoke and somehow conclude your words mean something far different. You are a committed textualist, Judge Kavanaugh. If you're going to hold others accountable for their words, you should be held accountable for your own words. So after my personal experience, I start these hearings with a question about your credibility as a witness. I know from my history with you that things you said need to be carefully verified. And that brings us to a major problem. I won't retread the ground about all the documents that are being withheld, but I'll show you a little calendar here that's interesting. There's a 35-month black hole in your White House career where we've been denied access to any and all documents. 35 months in the White House. And I asked you in my office, during that period of time, President Bush was considering same-sex marriage, an amendment to ban it, abortion, executive power, detainees, torture, Supreme Court nominees, warrantless wiretapping. One of these issues bears special mention as we mourn the passing of John McCain. In 2004, 2005, I joined John McCain when he led the effort to pass an amendment affirming that torture and cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment would be illegal in America. As a survivor of unspeakable torture, John McCain spoke with powerful moral authority about American values during the time of war. You were in the Bush White House when that McCain amendment passed. The Bush administration did everything in its power to stop John McCain's torture amendment. Then after we passed it 90-9, a veto-proof margin, President Bush issued a signing statement asserting his right to ignore the law that John McCain had just passed in Congress. When we met in my office, you acknowledged that you worked on that signing statement. Yet we've been denied any documents disclosing your role or your advice to President Bush. I asked you if you wrote, edited, or approved documents about these and other issues while you were staff secretary. Time and again, you said, I can't rule it out. Judge Kavanaugh, America needs to see those documents. We cannot carefully review, advise, and decide whether to consent to your nomination without clarity on the record. The period of time when you worked in the Republican White House led to a change in position on an issue which we have to address directly. Your views on executive power and accountability have changed dramatically. When you worked for Special Counsel Ken Starr in the late 1990s, you called him, quote, an American hero for investigating President Bill Clinton. And you personally urged Starr to be aggressive, confrontational, and even graphic in his questions. We've seen your memo on that one. But a few years later, after working in a Republican White House, you totally reversed your position and argued that presidents should be above the law and granted a free pass from criminal investigation while in office. What did you see in that Bush White House that dramatically changed your view? What are your views about presidential accountability today? Judge Kavanaugh, at this moment in our nation's history, with authoritarian forces threatening our democracy, with the campaign and administration of this president under federal criminal investigation, we need a direct, credible answer from you. Is this president or any president above the law? Equally important, can this president ignore the Constitution in the exercise of his authority? You dissented in the Seven Sky case when the D.C. Circuit upheld the Affordable Care Act's constitutionality. You criticized the law, a law which this president has said many times he wants to ignore and abolish. And you said, quote, the president may decline to enforce a statute that regulates private individuals when the president deems the statute unconstitutional, even if a court has held or would hold the statute constitutional. This statement by you flies in the face of Marbury versus Madison, our North Star in the separation of powers. It gives license to this president, Donald John Trump, or any president who chooses to ignore the Constitution to assert authority far beyond that envisioned by our founding fathers. There are many people who are watching carefully. I'm going to make a suggestion to you today, and it won't be popular on either side of the aisle. If you believe that your public record is one that you can stand behind and defend, I hope that at the end of this, you will ask this committee to suspend until we are given all the documents. until we have the time to review them. And then we resume this hearing. What I'm saying to you is basically this. If you will trust the American people, they will trust you. But if your effort today continues to conceal and hide documents, it raises a suspicion. I'll close, Mr. Chairman. I know you're anxious. When I was a practicing lawyer a long time ago in trial, and the other side either destroyed or concealed evidence, I knew that I was going to be able to have a convincing argument to close that case. What were they hiding? Why won't they let you see the speed tape on that train or the documents that they just can't find? You know that presumption now is against you because of all the documents that are held back. For the sake of this nation, for the sanctity of the Constitution that we both honor, step up, ask this meeting, this gathering, to suspend until all the documents of your public career are there for the American people to see. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Judge Kavanaugh. And thank you also, Ashley and Margaret and Eliza, for being here. I'm going to start by saying that the fact that there is so much angst over a single nominee, a single judicial nominee, tells you everything you need to know about why it is that we need judges, now more than ever, who are willing to read the law and interpret it based on what the law says rather than on the basis of something else. It also tells you more than anything else you could need to know about the need to restore a discussion of civics in this country, to restore a discussion about federalism and separation of powers, about where power is concentrated and where it shouldn't be, what the role of each branch of the federal government is and is not. Many of the comments, many of the outbursts that we've had today suggest that we need to return to some of those fundamental principles. And I don't care whether you're a liberal Democrat or a conservative Republican or something in between. These principles apply. They're principles to which we have sworn an oath. And they're principles that I think we would do well to restore and focus on once again. If ever we're to return to an era of civility, we will return to that era on the basis of those foundational, structural principles within our Constitution. Over the next few days, Judge Kavanaugh, a number of members of this committee are going to ask you questions. Questions about cases that you've handled as a lawyer, cases that you've decided as a judge, about your record, about your qualifications. And on that point about your record and your qualifications, the suggestion that you misled this committee at any point in your previous hearings is absurd. And the absurdity of that suggestion will be borne out in the coming days. I am certain of it. Some of the questions that will be asked of you will, in fact, be fair, and others will be unfair. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that at the outset. When you look back at history, answering these kinds of questions, this is sort of how the practice of holding these hearings began, so that senators could ask nominees how they might vote, how they might rule in particular cases. But this didn't always happen. In fact, it wasn't until 1916 that this even started. You see, there have been 113 justices confirmed to the Supreme Court so far. The first 66 were confirmed without even holding a hearing. The idea of a hearing is relatively new. It's about 102 years old. We went for between 125 and 130 years under our constitutional republic without ever having a hearing. But regardless, we started having hearings just over a century ago. The very first Supreme Court confirmation hearing occurred in 1916 with Justice Louis Brandeis. After Louis Brandeis was nominated to the court, some called for a hearing. Now, if we're honest with ourselves, if we're honest about history, I think a lot of this maybe had to do with some anti-sentiment fervor and the fact that Justice Brandeis was Jewish. But senators also wanted to determine whether Brandeis would use his seat on the Supreme Court to advocate for some of the things that he had advocated for as a private citizen, as a public interest attorney. They wanted to know how he might vote in particular cases. They didn't ask Justice Brandeis to testify significantly. but they did, in fact, ask some outside witnesses what they thought about his nomination. The next important moment, one could argue, occurred in 1939, when Felix Frankfurter became the first nominee to himself testify before the committee. At the time, Frankfurter was controversial in part because he was born overseas, but senators also worried that Frankfurter was a radical based on his defense of anarchists in court. So again, senators wanted assurances about how Frankfurter might rule in particular cases, in particular, what results he might reach in a particular type of case. Frankfurter, however, significantly declined to engage with senators on those topics and insisted that his public record spoke for itself. Justice Stewart's nomination in 1959 was another turning point. Senators seeking to resist Brown versus Board of Education wanted to grill Stewart on his views on integration. Others still wanted to grill Stewart about his views on national security. So senators turned up the heat a little bit more in that hearing. Like Frankfurter before him, Justice Stewart did not provide substantive answers to their questions. When they wanted to know how he might rule in particular cases, he appropriately declined, just as his predecessors had. 28 years later, 28 years after Justice Stewart came through this committee, the Senate considered Robert Bork's nomination to the Supreme Court. This was another significant turning point. And in my view, it remains something of a rock-bottom moment for the Senate and for the Senate Judiciary Committee. Without getting into any of the gory details here, I think it suffices to say that Senator Ted Kennedy and Judge Bork did not agree on certain matters of constitutional law. And Kennedy's response was to savage, unfairly in my opinion, the results that Judge Bork would reach if confirmed to the Supreme Court. The history shows that over the better part of a century, the Judiciary Committee has gradually created something of a new norm, a norm in which members demand that nominees speak about specific cases in return for favorable treatment from the committee as the jurists are going through this process. Now, nominees, for the most part, have gracefully resisted trading confirmation in exchange for promises about how they might vote in particular cases brought before them. To give two famous examples, Justice Scalia refused to say whether Marbury versus Madison was settled law on the ground that it could come before him. And sure enough, last term in Ortiz versus United States, the Supreme Court considered a case implicating the scope of Marbury. Likewise, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg created the so-called Ginsburg Standard. No previews, no forecasts, no hints. Every current member of the Supreme Court has adhered to a similar principle, what we might call the Ginsburg Standard. Even though nominees have not caved to the pressure, I still believe that there are some aspects of the Senate's approach here that might do a disservice to the country and might be frowned upon by future historians. If senators repeatedly ask nominees about outcomes, then the public will be more entitled, or at least more inclined, to think that judges are supposed to be outcome-minded, that that's supposed to be their whole approach to be to judging, that that's supposed to be what judging is in fact about. But this, of course, undermines the very legitimacy of the courts themselves, the very legitimacy of the tribunal you've been nominated by the president to serve on. Over time, no free people would accept a judiciary that simply imposes its own policy preferences on the country, absent fidelity to legal principle. There's a better way for the Senate to approach its work. This process, in my opinion, should be about your qualifications, about your character, and perhaps most importantly, about your approach to judging, your own view about the role of the federal judiciary. It should not be about results in a select number of cases. Now, you're obviously exceptionally well qualified. Even your staunchest critics would not claim otherwise. Your academic pedigree, your experience as a practicing lawyer, your experience in government, and your 12 years experience sitting on what many refer to as the second highest court in the land, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. You are independent. You've written that, quote, some of the greatest moments in American judicial history have been when judges stood up to the other branches, were not cowed, and enforced the law, close quote. You've said that judges cannot be buffaloed, influenced, or pressured into worrying too much about transient popularity when we are trying to decide a case, and that one of the most important duties of a judge is to stand up for the unpopular party who has the correct position. And you've lived up to your words during your time on the bench. Everyone knows that you served in the Bush administration. And yet, when you became a judge, in only 2 years, you ruled against the Bush administration a total of 8 times. For you, it simply doesn't matter who the parties are. It simply doesn't matter that you may have worked for an administration before you became a judge. The only thing that matters is your commitment to correctly applying the law to the facts of any particular case. As far as your approach to judging, you have appropriate respect for precedent. You co-authored an 800-page book on precedent that, among other things, explains that a change in a court's membership alone should not throw former decisions open to reconsideration or justify their reversal. You've explained that for precedent to be overruled, it must not be just wrong, but a case with serious practical consequences. You voted to overturn circuit precedent only 4 times during your time on the D.C. Circuit, and each of those cases involved a unanimous decision reached by your colleagues. And you follow binding precedent, even if you believe that binding precedent was itself wrongly decided. You decide cases based on legal merits, not based on the identity of the parties, and certainly not based on any political beliefs that you may harbor. You've already heard that your nomination will somehow be bad for women, for the environment, for labor unions, for civil rights, for a whole host of other things that Americans hold near and dear. I have a laundry list of cases in which you've ruled for people in each of those groups. But there's a more fundamental point here that I think needs to be made. The judiciary's decisions are legitimate only to the extent that they're based on sound legal principle and reasoning. And ruling for a preferred party is not itself a sound legal principle. It's quite to the contrary. Jury-rigging decisions and backfilling legal reasoning to reach a particular result, a particularly politically acceptable result in a particular case, no matter how desirable that result might be in any instance, is not a legitimate mode of judicial decision-making. And no free people purporting to have an independent judiciary should ever be willing to settle for that. So my plea to my colleagues today is that we ask Judge Kavanaugh hard questions. I believe we're required to do so. The Senate is not and never should be a rubber stamp, particularly when it comes to issuing lifetime appointments, even lifetime appointments on the highest court in the land. But if you disagree with an opinion he's written, make a legal argument as to that issue. Explain why you think it's wrong. Don't complain about the results as if the result itself is proof that he's wrong when you separate out the result from the legal analysis, from the facts and how they interact with the law in that particular case. And don't ask him to make promises about outcomes in particular cases. If it's unacceptable for the President to impose a litmus test, it is surely unacceptable for the United States Senate to do so. Judge Kavanaugh, I look forward to your testimony, and I'm grateful to you and your willingness to serve our country and to be considered for this important role.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When is pattern evidence of bias? In court, pattern is evidence of bias all the time, evidence on which juries and trial judges rely to show discriminatory intent, to show a common scheme, to show bias. When does a pattern prove bias? I wish this were an idle question. It's relevant to the pattern of the Roberts Court when its Republican majority goes off on partisan excursions through the civil law. That is, when all 5 Republican appointees, the Roberts 5, we can call them, go raiding off together, and no Democratic appointee joins them. Does this happen often? The Roberts 5 has gone on almost 80 of these partisan excursions since Roberts became chief. That's a lot of times. And there's a feature to these 80 cases. They almost all implicate interests important to the big funders and influencers of the Republican Party. When the Republican justices go off on these 5-justice partisan excursions, there's a big Republican corporate or partisan interest involved 92% of the time. The tiny handful of these cases that don't implicate an interest of the big Republican influencers is so flukishly few that we can set them aside. Let's look at the 73 cases that all implicate a major Republican Party interest. Again, 73 is a lot of cases at the Supreme Court. Is there a pattern to these 73 cases? Oh, yes, there is. Every time a big Republican corporate or partisan interest is involved, the big Republican interest wins. Every time. Let me repeat. In 73 partisan decisions where there's a big Republican interest at stake, the big Republican interest wins. Every damned time. Thus, the mad scramble of big Republican interest groups to protect a Roberts 5 that will reliably give them wins. Really big wins sometimes. I note that when the Roberts 5 saddles up, these so-called conservatives are anything but judicially conservative. They readily overturn precedent, toss out statutes passed by wide bipartisan margins, and decide on broad constitutional issues that they need not reach. Modesty, originalism, stare decisis, all these supposedly conservative judicial principles all have the hoofprints of the Roberts 5 all across their backs, wherever those principles got in the way of those wins for the big Republican interests. The litany of Roberts 5 decisions explains why big Republican interests want Judge Kavanaugh on the court so badly. So badly that Republicans trampled so much Senate precedent to push him through. So let's review the highlights reel. What do big Republican interests want? Well, first, they want to win elections. What has the Roberts 5 delivered? Help Republicans gerrymander elections. Veith v. Jubelirer, 5-4, license to gerrymander. Help Republicans keep minority voters away from the polls. Shelby County, 5-4, and Bartlett v. Strickland, 5-4, and Abbott v. Perez, 5-4, despite the trial judge finding the Texas legislature actually intended to target and suppress minority voters. And the big one, help corporate front group money flood elections. Big money interests love unlimited power to buy elections, lobby, and threaten and bully Congress. McCutcheon, 5-4, counting the concurrence, Bullock, 5-4, and the infamous, grotesque 5-4 Citizens United decision, which I believe stands beside Lochner on the court's roll of shame. What else do big influencers want? To get out of courtrooms. Big influencers hate courtrooms because they're lobbying and electioneering and threatening doesn't work, or at least it's not supposed to. In a courtroom, big influencers used to getting their way have to suffer the indignity of equal treatment. So the Roberts 5 protects corporations from group class action lawsuits. Walmart v. Dukes, 5-4. Comcast, 5-4. And this past term, Epic Systems, 5-4. The Roberts 5 helps corporations steer customers and workers away from courtrooms and into mandatory arbitration. Concepcion, Italian Colors, and Rent-A-Center, all Roberts 5. Epic Systems does double duty here because now workers can't even arbitrate their claims as a group. Hindering access to the courthouse for plaintiffs generally. Iqbal, 5-4. Protecting corporations from being taken to court by employees. Harmed through pay discrimination, Ledbetter, 5-4. Age discrimination, Gross, 5-4. Harassment, Vance, 5-4. And retaliation, Nassar, 5-4. Even insulating corporations from liability for international human rights violations, Gessner, 5-4. Corporations aren't in the Constitution. Juries are. Indeed, courtroom juries are the one element of American government designed to protect people against encroachments by private wealth and power. So, of course, the Roberts 5 rules for wealthy, powerful corporations over jury rights every time, with nary a mention of the 7th Amendment. What's another one? Oh yeah, a classic, helping big business bust unions. Harris v. Quinn, 5-4, and Janus v. AFSCME this year, 5-4, overturning a 40-year precedent. Lots of big Republican influencers are polluters who like to pollute for free. So the Roberts 5 delivers partisan decisions that let corporate polluters pollute. To pick a few, Rapanos, weakening wetland protections, 5-4. National Association of Home Builders, weakening protections for endangered species, 5-4. Michigan v. EPA, helping air polluters, 5-4. And in the face of emerging climate havoc, there's the procedurally aberrant 5-4 partisan decision to stop the EPA Clean Power Plan. Pattern. Then come Roberts 5 bonus decisions advancing a far-right social agenda. Gonzalez v. Carhart upholding restrictive abortion laws. Hobby Lobby granting corporations religious rights over the health care rights of their employees. NIFLA letting states deny women truthful information about their reproductive choices. All 5-4, all Republican. Add Heller and McDonald, which reanimated for the gun industry a theory a former Chief Justice once called a fraud. Both decisions 5-4. This year, Trump v. Hawaii, 5-4, rubber stamping the Muslim travel ban. And in case Wall Street was feeling left out, helping insulate investment bankers from fraud claims, Janus Capital, 5-4. Pattern. No wonder the American people feel the game is rigged. Here's how the game works. Big business and partisan groups fund the Federalist Society, which picked Gorsuch and now you. As the White House counsel admitted, they insourced the Federalist Society for this selection. Exactly how the nominees were picked and who was in the room where it happened and who had a vote or a veto and what was said or promised, that's all a deep, dark secret. Then big business and partisan groups fund the Judicial Crisis Network, which runs dark money political campaigns to influence senators in confirmation votes, as they've done for Gorsuch and now for you. Who pays millions of dollars for that and what their expectations are? is a deep, dark secret. These groups also fund Republican election campaigns with dark money and keep the identity of big donors a deep, dark secret. And of course, 90% of your documents are to us a deep, dark secret. Then, once the nominee's on the court, the same business front groups with ties to the Koch brothers and other funders of the Republican political machine file